5 months of grueling work finally came to an end. Mr. Keith got everything he wanted from his demands. Everything had been modernized to his standards, and we were given a much-needed break from his tyrannical rule, albeit temporarily. He did retract one of his earlier decisions, however. He actually reopened the brewery. He admitted that shutting it down was a mistake on his part and decided to bring it back to its former glory. However, the farm and airboat rental business would remain closed. The workshop looked nothing like how it used to. It was organized and neat and all, but something about its atmosphere just wasn't the same. Now that I think about it, Mr. Keith was right to move me from there because the familiar sewer smell had returned. Yes, the same smell that originated from the early airboat rental shop years ago was now present in the new workshop, and admittedly I was a bit grateful I didn't have to deal with that dreaded stench again, though I felt bad for anyone who had to work there and adapt to that smell at the same time. In the office, meanwhile, Mrs. Dickerson was taking a look at the sales figures for the month.
It seems that Mr. Keith's financial decisions are really taking a toll on our sales.
Mrs. Dickerson said.
You don't say.
Amelia said.
Ever since he closed both the farm and the airboat rental place, we've been losing a lot of revenue. Also, look at all the people he laid off these past few months. That just made things worse.
How many clients did we lose ever since he took over?
Tommy asked.
Over 20. None of them want to do business here now that he's taken over.
Something about these numbers doesn't quite add up.
Mark said.
What do you mean?
Well, if I say as honest though, how was Mr. Keith able to pay for the oil refinery in the first place? How was he able to pay for all of these overhauls? I thought the budget only had so much money in it.
Wait, we have an oil refinery now. Do we even need that?
Well, not right now. There was never a demand for it, yet he built it anyway.
And yet we barely had to deliver any oil to any of our clients ever since it was built, thus making the oil refinery basically worthless. Maybe we would have needed it in a few years' time, but right now we don't need it at all.
Heck, all the money wasted on that would have been put towards paying all the employees he fired.
And maybe if he didn't shut down important businesses, we wouldn't have lost so much revenue.
With all this information, Mrs. Dickerson grew suspicious of Mr. Keith's motives.
Can you guys please keep a secret?
Sure.
Mrs. Dickerson told her staff that she was going to be away from the office for a while. Her plan was to spy on Mr. Keith to see what he was doing with all the money he was spending. She wanted to make sure that he wasn't doing anything illegal, and any evidence she could find would be used in the eventual lawsuit against him. My former boss, by the way, used to be an intelligence agent for Red. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, she could. She would start this operation of hers off by going to the local 7-Eleven because that was where Mr. Keith usually went at lunchtime. She saw him at the payphone out front. He was apparently bragging to the person on the other end of the line about all the money he was making.
This was never suspected a thing. We'll have enough money to build several mansions in Jamaica by the end of the year. Just you wait and see.
He apparently said. Mrs. Dickerson wasn't too sure what to make of all this, thought she would need more evidence before she could do anything about it. Mr. Keith was probably working with some shady businessman. He could be making large purchases using Red's money without any knowledge of his superiors, not to mention shutting down certain businesses without the administration's knowledge or consent could be a criminal offense. She needed more proof, though. She was away for over a month trying to get more proof. Those that knew what she was up to remained quiet. Mr. Keith didn't suspect a thing, as Mrs. Dickerson told him that she was to go on a vacation prior to her starting her investigation. Her staff hoped she could save Mountain Lab from Mr. Keith's wrath. She was our only hope. Another thunderstorm rolled through Mountain Lab. No, don't worry, no one was storm chasing this time. In addition to this, there was hail, a very rare sight in this place. None of us were aware of this storm. It just happened randomly. At first, the rain was light and slow, but then it just kept on getting heavier and heavier. Then the wind started picking up as the lightning started flashing. Every now and then the thunder seemed to get even louder, almost deafening. Then the hail started, and it was as large as baseballs. We all had to take shelter. At the time, most of us were working outside, and the first place most of us took shelter in was the new workshop. I hid elsewhere. Those that hid in the workshop thought they were safe. They unfortunately weren't. The hail was powerful enough to damage the roof, and the support beams could not hold it up. Parts of the roof suddenly came crashing down, and the falling debris landed on a majority of the workers. Those that were outside the workshop had no idea what had happened. The rest of us just waited for the storm to pass. A survivor actually came out of the wrecked workshop severely injured and walked all the way to the nearest phone booth to call for help. I salute that person, whoever he or she is. After the storm passed, we all came out of our shelters. We approached the workshop, which was now a wreck. This shocked all of us. Surely the workshop's roof would have been able to handle the hail. The old one sure did, and yet this new one that they had just completed the month before couldn't handle such little damage. The first thing I thought of when I saw the wreck was, how could this have happened? We then heard the sounds of survivors coming out of the wreckage, some still shaken up. The rest, however, were still trapped. We had to wait for the rescue team to arrive. They made it quickly, and we helped the survivors to safety as well. Sadly, we couldn't save everyone. There were around 30 people hiding in the workshop. 9 of them were crushed to death. A further 5 died from their injuries. 7 were injured. 1 of them had sadly been paralyzed from the waist down, and the rest were unhurt. Mrs. Dickerson, meanwhile, was driving back to Mountain Lab, having gathered all the evidence she needed against Mr. Keith. When she arrived, she could see the administration questioning Mr. Keith about the accident.
Mr. Keith, we've heard that you demolished the old workshop and replaced it with this new one just recently. You never asked us for permission to do that, and then you basically used your own company's money without their knowledge. Also, it appears that you used inadequate materials to build this new workshop, which led to the roof collapsing under the severe weather we just had today.
One of the investigators said. Mrs. Dickerson approached them and showed the administration the evidence she had gathered.
You sent company funds to a Jamaican construction company. Not only that, you shut down businesses you had no authority over, laid off dozens of workers without our approval.
The list of all of the crimes Mr. Keith was guilty of went on. It was very clear that he abused his own power. Just because he was a former board member of Red, that didn't give him unlimited power over everything. The safety committee had to come and inspect every single building he had constructed. Unsurprisingly, all of them violated safety standards. All of them needed to be torn down. In addition to all the evidence Mrs. Dickerson gathered against him, the administration had no choice but to terminate him. He would also be facing legal charges and was held responsible for the deaths of the 14 people who died in the workshop. He was charged with money laundering, illegal spending of company funds, manslaughter, violation of safety standards, destruction of property, and the list went on. He was ultimately imprisoned for 6 years. He would also be banned from ever entering Red and Blue property again. With Mr. Keith gone, a new manager for Red would need to be found. We all knew who would take his place. Yep, Mrs. Dickerson, who had been the boss of the office for several years, was now the manager of Red's property in Mountain Lab. She was determined to fix every problem that Mr. Keith had created. Unsurprisingly, she kept her promise. The following 7 months were very eventful. She reopened the farm and the airboat rental business for starters, and had all the demolished buildings rebuilt with proper materials. She rehired most of the former workers too. In addition to this, she attracted new clients, and soon our sales had increased by 50%, making us the top dogs once again. I was definitely happy to have her as the manager instead of Mr. Keith. Our future at Mountain Lab was definitely looking bright. Everything seemed back to normal now. We had a manager we could trust, and we were making sales again. A few days ago, a sawmill had been built, and Mrs. Dickerson chose me to test it out. After carefully testing it, she opened it up for us to work in. I was reassigned to work at this new sawmill naturally. On our first day, a large quantity of lumber needed to be cut down, putting a strain on us, though that didn't stop Josh from being so enthusiastic. I wasn't exactly sure why, so I came up to him. "You are looking rather pleased with yourself, Josh," I said.
And for good reason. My good man Ashley and I are getting married in 2 weeks.
Josh replied. "Really? Well, no wonder you're so cheerful. Congratulations."
Thanks, Luke. I'm glad you approve.
Of course I approve. It's great news. Am I invited to the wedding?
Yeah, of course. I was wondering if you'd be my best man.
I'd be honored.
Great. Anyway, let's get back to work.
Yeah, good idea. We returned to work soon after. The first load of lumber was soon ready to go, and I was chosen to deliver it to Dimming. As I walked to the loading dock, I could see Josh working near the wood chipper. What are you up to, Josh?
I'm cutting some wood to feed into the chipper.
When I heard this, I was rather nervous. Would there, are you sure you're capable of operating that?
Of course I am. I went to safety training.
Oh, right.
Is something wrong?
You see, a while ago, there was an accident in Clovis involving a wood chipper.
What happened?
It's best that I not go into details, but let's just say it wasn't pretty.
I see. Don't worry though, I'll be careful.
Okay then, I have to make a delivery to Dimming. See you later.
See you later, Luke.
I probably shouldn't have been so skeptical. After all, he was a bit of an expert with the chipper. I just had a gut feeling that something bad would happen. He would be working alone around the chipper, which definitely should have been a red flag, though he was managing just fine. I still couldn't help but be nervous as I drove to Dimming. Josh had been working with the chipper for almost 2 hours and hadn't broken a sweat, though after those 2 hours a sudden behavior change would take place. There just so happened to be a camera overlooking the wood chipper, and it's still unclear what exactly led up to the accident because there was no audio, but the footage didn't lie. Also, somebody sent me the video footage many years later, and honestly, after watching it, I wanted to grab a hold of the camera myself and destroy it so that no one would ever see the footage ever again. My guess as to what exactly happened goes as follows. Josh, being so excited about marrying Ashley, started daydreaming about all the great things he was going to do with her after the wedding. He became so caught up in his daydreaming that he started to walk towards the chipper without paying attention to what he was doing. He was pulled into the chipper by a strong force, and you know what, the less said about this, the better. The video footage showed that he didn't get the chance to cry for help because it just happened unexpectedly. The sad part was that no one was around to stop him from getting himself killed, but even if there was anyone around, there was just no saving him, as it was determined that he was killed the moment he entered the chipper. Also, no one even heard the gruesome sound that the chipper made. It wasn't until I got back that Josh's death was even discovered.
Hey, Luke. Josh never showed up for lunch today. Have you seen him?
Joseph asked. No, I haven't, but I'm sure he's busy working on the wood chipper still, I replied. I decided to check for myself. I was so sure that Josh was fine. I walked towards the chipper, but found no signs of him. The chipper sounded like it was jammed, and there was a lot of rustling and other odd noises, so I went to try and fix it. That was when I made one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I looked inside that damn chipper. I was expecting a large pile of wood stuck inside the chipper. Instead, what I found were the mangled remains of a man and blood. A lot of blood. Oh my God, I screamed. I immediately looked away from the chipper and then backed away from it. I ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. I was so sick to my stomach that I wanted nothing more than to throw up. I then tripped and fell face first into the ground. Oh God, I can't hold it in any longer, I groaned. I could not reach the nearest trash can in time, so I just threw up where I lay. Casey had the displeasure of witnessing this spectacle.
Jesus Christ, Luke, are you okay?
Casey asked. Yeah, I just threw up. I'm totally fine. What the fuck do you think? I snapped. Casey was startled by how I just snapped at him. I had never lost it like that before.
Yo, you look as if you just saw a ghost.
No, I saw something worse than a ghost.
What did you see?
I could barely respond. I just stared at him with a look of fear. Casey, whatever you do, do not look inside the wood chipper.
The wood chipper? What are you talking about?
I said don't look in there. Casey let curiosity get the better of him. He chose to ignore my warning and looked inside. He let out a horrified scream and immediately backed away. He too threw up. I crawled all the way to the payphone and called the police. When they arrived, everyone was confused. No one other than Casey and I knew what happened. The police looked inside the chipper and took photographs. They then examined the remains, and unfortunately it was confirmed that the remains belonged to Josh. The area was closed off as they began cleaning up the chipper. I'm sure cleaning up that bloody mess was no fun for whoever did it, nor would I wish that job on anyone. The investigation was quick, and Josh's death was eventually ruled accidental, and no one was held responsible. We had all mourned at the loss of our friend. We had all struggled to come to terms with what had happened. We all knew that it wasn't our fault, but somehow we still felt responsible. The worst part, however, was that somebody had to inform Ashley. Like, what were we supposed to say to her? That her fiancé had been killed in a wood chipper accident? How would she feel about that? Sadly, she was eventually told, and she was heartbroken when she found out. Obviously, she was there for his funeral, as were all his family and friends, but she didn't look at us in the eye. It was clear that she was very distraught. After the funeral, we tried to help her as much as we could, but sadly it didn't make much of a difference, as understandably she wanted to join her fiancé in death. Many days later, she took her own life. As for both me and Casey, we were deemed traumatized, and it took a while before we were able to fully recover. Mrs. Dickerson understood how we were feeling, and she sent us back to the workshop. The workshop, by the way, was rebuilt almost exactly how it was before. The sewer smell was gone and the atmosphere was back to normal. I was glad I was sent back there because it felt like home to me. I just hoped another tragedy like the one I witnessed wouldn't happen again.